poor waitress accidentally discovers a photo of her late mother in the wallet of a mysterious billionaire. Her mother never once mentioned this man. Why does he carry that picture? And what secret has been buried for over 2 decades? She decides to dig deeper and uncovers a truth that could change her life forever. The night in the suburban neighborhood always carried a peculiar sadness. Not the hollow loneliness, but a weary silence that crept behind each darkened windowpane. The sign of the diner, Evelyn's Diner, flickered in the cold breeze, the light from the E blinking like a heart beating half-heartedly. Inside, only one person remained awake. Zoe Williams bent over to wipe the counter, her hands aching after a shift that had stretched nearly 10 hours. The smell of stale coffee, the ticking of the clock, and the small radio playing an old jazz tune filled the space with a mix of coziness and melancholy. Hardly anyone came in after midnight anymore, except for long-haul truckers or wandering sleepless souls. Zoe glanced at the clock, 12:47 a.m. She let out a long breath, folding the rag, silently counting the minutes as they passed. Just a few more wipes and she could lock up, go home, and slip under the thin blanket in her run-down apartment. A night like any other, or so she thought. Ding! The door chime rang out, sharp and resonant, shattering the quiet atmosphere. Zoe flinched and turned around. It wasn't a weary trucker. It wasn't a homeless person seeking shelter from the wind. It was a man. He stepped inside, tall and imposing, draped in a meticulously tailored black suit, his polished leather shoes spotless, untouched by even a speck of dust. There was something about him that made the room seem to hold its breath. Not just his striking appearance, but his eyes, cold, deep, as though accustomed to the world hanging on his every word. Zoe froze. For reasons she couldn't explain, a chill ran down her spine in that split second. This man, he didn't belong here. And then, as if the ordinariness of this night had officially come to an end, Zoe felt it clearly. Something had just shifted. The man said nothing as he entered, his gaze sweeping the diner, not at Zoe, not at the menu, but out toward the window where the empty street bathed in the faint yellow glow of the lamps. Zoe grabbed a menu and approached, but he gave a slight shake of his head, dismissing it. "Black coffee." His voice was low, firm, like a command issued daily in upscale places. Zoe nodded slightly, heading to the coffee machine while stealing glances at him through the mirror. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his demeanor calm but far too polished, like a CEO stepping out of a global summit rather than someone seeking coffee at nearly 1 a.m. She set the cup down on the table. "No thank you, not even a glance." Zoe turned away, accustomed to indifference. But then, a faint sound broke the silence, like paper rustling as it hit the floor. She looked back. On the tiled floor lay a photograph. Something stirred inside her. Zoe bent down to pick it up, and in that moment the world seemed to stop. It was her mother. That gentle smile, the softly curled hair, the warm eyes that had cradled her childhood through years of hardship. Zoe couldn't mistake it. The photo, it was nearly identical to the one her mother had always kept in a small wooden box beneath her pillow. But why? Why would a stranger carry her mother's picture in his wallet? Her heart pounded. She looked up, the photo trembling in her hand. Where did you get this?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely recognizable to herself. For the first time, the man's eyes met hers. The sharp blue in them paused, assessed, then quickly turned empty. "You're mistaken," he said coldly, snatching the photo back and tucking it into his wallet as if it were just a random scrap of paper. Zoe stepped back, dazed. She knew she wasn't wrong. That photo was a piece of her childhood, a fragment of her soul. "No, I'm not mistaken, that's my mother." "Why do you have it?" He stood, ignoring her question. He pulled out a bill, a crisp $100, placed it on the table and turned to leave as if nothing had happened. Zoe stood frozen, her hand clenched into a fist. A photo. A denial. And a vague feeling hardening into certainty. This man wasn't as unfamiliar as he wanted her to believe. She didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing: this was only the beginning. Zoe didn't think. She only knew she was moving fast, almost running out from behind the counter, her heart hammering in her chest. The strange man was already at the door, his shadow stretching long across the icy sidewalk. "Wait!" she shouted, the sound bursting from her like it had broken free from her chest. Richard paused, his hand resting on the door of a sleek black luxury car parked right at the curb. The driver, dressed in a black suit, had just opened the door and shot her a wary glance. Zoe hurried toward him, her breath coming in short gasps. She held up the photo. The same photo, now in her hands like a stolen piece of memory. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "just tell me, how did you know my mother, Evelyn Williams?" Her name was Evelyn. A flicker, just a flicker. In those cold eyes, something stirred, like a memory brushing against an unhealed wound. But just as quickly it vanished, the man Richard. Richard turned to face her, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Not cold now, but guarded." "You've got the wrong person," he replied, his voice low but firm. "I don't know anyone named Evelyn." "No, you do," Zoe shook her head. "I've seen that photo 100 times. My mother had an identical one. She kept it like a treasure." "Why do you have it?" Richard's grip tightened on his wallet, his jaw clenching. A gust of wind swept through, carrying the sharp cold scent of gasoline from the late-night street, making everything feel desolate. Zoe saw his hand curl into a fist, not out of anger, but as if bracing himself. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping lower, almost hissing through gritted teeth. "I don't owe you any explanations. You don't know me, and I don't know you." "But you knew my mother," Zoe pleaded, her tone bordering on desperation. "Please. She's gone now, at least. Enough," Richard cut her off. No anger, no further explanation, just a curt shake of his head before he turned, sliding into the back seat of the waiting car. The door shut, the tinted window rolled up, the engine roared to life. For a split second, Zoe thought she might scream, run after him, pound on the glass like in the movies. But she just stood there, frozen on the sidewalk, the photo trembling in her hand. That man had just thrust her into a maze with no answers. And worst of all, he left her with a feeling she couldn't deny. He was hiding something, and it was directly tied to her mother. Zoe couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her cramped room, the lights off but her mind ablaze like a night set on fire. The photo of her mother, an exact copy of the one tucked in that man's wallet, sat on the table, an open wound that wouldn't close. "Who are you?" The question swirled endlessly in her head, like a clock that refused to stop ticking. By nearly 3 a.m., Zoe sat up, pulling her old laptop toward her. The screen flickered to life, reflecting her face. Dark circles under her eyes, but a gaze sharp as a blade. She started typing. Billionaire, white, late 40s to early 50s, blue eyes, real estate, New York area. The first results popped up, a parade of faces, CEOs, billionaires, investors, but none carried the eyes Zoe couldn't forget. She scrolled. Hundreds of names, thousands of faces. Her eyes burned, her lips cracked dry. She nearly slammed the laptop shut, convinced she was chasing a ghost. Until she saw that face beneath the headline. Richard Bennett, chairman of Bennett Global Enterprises, a real estate empire spanning New York to Dubai. Zoe clicked the photo. Her heart almost stopped. It was him. No doubt about it, the suit, those eyes, the way he stared into the camera as if commanding the world. She read on. Harvard graduate, known for his reclusive lifestyle, never married, no children. Zoe froze. No children? No mention of Evelyn, no relationships, no trace. She clicked through other articles, biographies, investment news, interviews, but they were all the same, polished, tightly controlled, as if his past had been scrubbed clean. Zoe leaned back in her chair, her eyes still glued to the screen. Each line felt like a knife slicing through the scattered fragments of her mother's memory. Richard Bennett wasn't a stranger. He was something her mother had hidden her entire life. But why? Out of fear, out of pain, or to protect her? Zoe clenched her fists. She didn't have all the answers, but she had one certainty. That man was living with a secret, and she would be the one to force him to reveal it. The next morning, the city seemed busier than ever. People rushing, cars trailing each other in the familiar rhythm of urban life. But Zoe saw none of it. In her mind there was only one name, Richard Bennett. The headquarters of Bennett Global Enterprises towered like a frigid block of ice in the heart of Manhattan, its glass reflecting the silver-gray sky, its revolving doors swallowing a steady stream of impeccably dressed people. Zoe stood on the opposite curb, her heart pounding, her hands ice-cold in her coat pockets. She had no appointment, no business card, no right to step inside. But she had the truth, and the blood in her veins might just carry the name Bennett. She crossed the street, shoulders back, determined. "Hello. I need to see Richard Bennett," Zoe said at the reception desk, her voice steadier than she'd expected. The woman behind the counter didn't even look up. "Sorry, Mr. Bennett doesn't see unscheduled visitors." "I'm not a visitor. This is important. It's about Evelyn Williams." The name made the receptionist pause. But then she frowned, her expression icing over again. "Sorry," she repeated. "I can help you." Zoe stepped back, scanning the lobby. Security guards flanked the sides. Turnstiles required key cards. Employees bustled about, all seeming to be in a hurry to get somewhere. And then she saw her chance. A young employee, holding a coffee cup and a stack of papers, approached the turnstile. He looked new, eyes on his phone, feet moving quickly. Zoe didn't hesitate. She sped up, falling into step beside him. "Hey, wait," she whispered, feigning urgency. "You forgot to send the report to Bennett's office this morning. They're waiting."
"What?"
The employee blinked, caught off guard. Zoe slipped right behind him, using his keycard swipe to glide through the turnstile and head straight for the elevators. A guard glanced at her briefly, too many people to notice she didn't belong. The elevator doors closed. She pressed the button for the top floor. Her heart thundered like a drum. She was about to face the man who might be her father. The metal doors slid open. A quiet, luxurious hallway with brown carpeting stretched out before her, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A man in a black suit approached, frowning when he saw her. "Who are you? Do you have an appointment?" Zoe took a deep breath. "My name is Zoe Williams. I'm here to see Richard Bennett. It's about my mother. He doesn't see strangers." "Tell him my mother's name is Evelyn Williams, and I'm not leaving until he shows up." The man stared at her, then stepped back, disappearing behind a door at the end of the hall. Time crawled by like dripping water. Zoe's hand tightened around the zipper of her coat. She didn't know what she was hoping for, a confession, an embrace, or another shock. The doors swung open. Richard Bennett stepped out, the same commanding presence, the same pristine, wrinkle-free suit. But this time, his eyes didn't skim past her. They locked on, direct, piercing. In those eyes, something cracked. Not surprise, not anger, but a deep, hidden wariness, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time and wishing it would never come. "Come in," he said curtly. The office door closed behind them. Inside, the silence of the past quietly stirred awake. Zoe stood facing him, unblinking. "Why," she began, her voice nearly choking. "Why do you have my mother's photo? Why did you pretend you didn't know anything?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He opened his wallet, pulled out the photo, the same one, and placed it on the desk like undeniable evidence. Zoe stared at it, then back at the man before her. "You knew my mother," she whispered. Richard responded with a sentence that sucked the air from the room. "I didn't just know her." The words rang out, soft yet like a thunderclap. I loved her. Zoe didn't know how to react. She stood frozen, the world tilting in that fleeting moment. The air in the office suddenly thickened, as if each spoken word had thrust them both into a space of memories never before unlocked. Richard sat down, his broad shoulders slumping slightly, as though shedding an invisible burden. Those blue eyes were no longer cold. They were somber, carrying the weight of a winter spanning years gone by. "I loved your mother, Zoe," he said, his voice low and hoarse, as if each word sliced at his throat. "More than anyone in my life. But I let her go. Not because I wanted to, because I was too much of a coward." Zoe stood there, unblinking. She didn't know what hurt more, the confession or the emptiness behind it. "I came from a family where everything was controlled," Richard continued, his gaze distant. "Name, status, wealth, every step mapped out. Evelyn didn't fit into that world, and I was too weak to fight for her." Zoe clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms until they drew blood. "So you abandoned my mother for money?" she snapped, each word falling into the silence with ruthless precision. Richard didn't deny it. He gave a faint nod, as if he couldn't forgive himself either. "They threatened to cut me off from the inheritance, push me out of the company, erase my name from the family. I thought, if I tried, I could come back for her later, give her the life she deserved. But..." He stopped, his eyes darkening. "When I came back, she was gone. No word, no trace, as if Evelyn had never existed." Zoe felt her throat tighten. She remembered the nights her mother sat silently by the window, staring into the darkness without ever explaining why. She remembered how her mother always dodged questions about her father. She remembered it all, and now the pieces were falling into place, one by one, forming a painful picture. "My mother died in poverty," Zoe said, her voice dry. "She raised me alone, working 2-3 jobs at a time, while you," she swallowed her anger, "lived in glass towers like this, wore suits, drank $5,000 bottles of wine, and never thought of her." Richard didn't respond immediately. He lowered his head, his hand resting on the photo lying quietly on the desk, the photo of Evelyn. "I thought of her every day," he whispered. "I've paid for that decision with the rest of my life." Zoe stepped back, her heart heavy. "My mother never told me anything about you," she said softly. "Not a word, not a picture. You were erased from my memory as if you'd never existed." A sad smile flickered at the corner of Richard's lips. "Because she wanted to protect you from me." The air fell silent. Those words dropped into the void between them, like the final crack in a dividing wall. Zoe turned away, her eyes stinging. She couldn't take it anymore. Not because he'd loved her mother, but because he'd abandoned them both, and came back too late. She walked out of the room without another word. The door closed behind her, not as an ending, but as a pause before the next storm. That night, Zoe didn't cry, not because she wasn't in pain, but because the pain had surpassed tears. Like a storm with no rain left, only howling winds and silent wreckage within her heart. Her small apartment was the same as always, quiet, cramped, smelling of old wood and clothes yet to dry. But now everything seemed layered with new meaning. The photo of her mother on the small altar, that gentle gaze. It was no longer a mystery. It was part of a truth hidden her whole life. Zoe sat on the floor, pulling an old wooden box from under the bed. It was the box her mother had kept for years, where she stored letters, faded photos, a few commemorative coins, and a scrap of fabric wrapped around Zoe's name from when she was born. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. The faint scent of time wafted up. Old paper, memories. She sifted through the contents, flipping through each item. Everyday moments, her mother holding her as a baby, the two of them laughing next to a broken brake bicycle, a handful of handmade birthday cards her mother had crafted. And then, She saw it, a small velvet pouch, faded with age, tucked beneath the paper lining at the bottom of the box, as if her mother had deliberately hidden it deep down, waiting for the right moment. Zoe opened it, her heart pounding. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, its round pendant engraved with 3 words: forgive, love, begin. On the back of the pendant, a tiny blurry photo, a young man with dark hair and familiar eyes. Zoe froze. It was him, Richard, in his youth. Next to the necklace was a folded scrap of paper, written in the soft handwriting Zoe had memorized since childhood. This belongs to your father. I kept it not out of regret, but so that one day, if you're strong enough to face it, you'll understand I love you more than the dreams I left unfinished. Zoe folded the paper, her hands gripping the necklace tightly. She didn't know if she was trembling from the cold, from anger, or because her heart had just shattered and pieced itself back together in a strange new way. Everything she'd once believed had shifted. Her father wasn't a nameless figure. He had a face, a name, a history with her mother, and he was still alive. Zoe clutched the pendant in her palm as if clinging to the 3 words etched upon it. Forgive, love, begin. She wasn't sure she was ready for all 3, but maybe. It was time to go back, to ask until the very end and to decide whether that past deserved to be rewritten once more by her own hand. The next morning, Zoe stood before the Bennett Global Enterprises building once again, but this time, she didn't hide, didn't sneak in behind someone else, didn't mask her reason or give a vague introduction. This time, she walked in as herself. The silver necklace rested in her palm, its engraved words faintly glinting under the early daylight. Forgive, love, begin. Zoe wasn't sure which she was ready for, but she knew one thing: if she didn't face this, she'd never know the full truth. The receptionist was the same woman, still wearing that polite but distant expression. "Hello, I'd like to see Richard Bennett," Zoe said, her voice steady and firm. "As I've said." Zoe opened her hand. The silver necklace lay quietly in her palm, its pendant facing the receptionist. "I tell him Evelyn Williams' daughter is here, and she's brought what she left behind." The woman froze, her eyes wavering for the first time. Without a word, she picked up the phone. Less than a minute later, 2 security guards approached. Zoe thought they'd ask her to leave, but then a voice echoed from the end of the hallway. "Let her in." Zoe turned. Richard Bennett stood there, silent as if he'd been waiting. No pristine suit today. He wore a white dress shirt with rolled-up sleeves, and his eyes, tired but no longer cold. He turned and walked into his office without a word. Zoe followed, her heart a tangled mess. The door closed behind them. Neither spoke. Zoe placed the necklace on the desk. A simple gesture, but it thickened the air in the room. Richard stared at it. His hand reached out, brushing the pendant. Then he stopped. He didn't pick it up. He just looked. "She kept it," he said softly, his voice emerging from a distant memory. "Not just kept it," Zoe replied, her eyes fixed on him. "My mother left it for me, with a photo of you, and a note." Richard looked up, his gaze meeting hers, this time unguarded, unaverted. "I didn't know," he said. "I had no idea she was pregnant. If I'd known there was a child." Zoe cut him off. "You didn't know? Because you weren't there." The words sliced through, not with anger anymore, but with pain. Richard nodded faintly. "That's right. I wasn't there, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want—" He faltered as if his throat were choked by something never before spoke. "A chance to be accountable, even if it's just a small part of the rest of your life." Zoe fell silent. The word "you" from his lips felt both foreign and familiar, like a scar brushing the deepest roots of her childhood. "Do you know," she said, "how many times I saw my mother cry at night? How many times I asked about my father and she just smiled and changed the subject? I thought he was poor or dead. I never imagined he was living in a place like this, surrounded by glass, gold, and power. Richard turned his face away, but Zoe caught the torment in his eyes, a man who'd once had everything and lost what mattered most. My mother once wrote, "One day, if you're strong enough, you'll understand." Zoe lifted her head. Today, I'm standing here. I'm not sure I understand, but I want to know. Silence stretched between them. Richard let out a long breath. Thank you for coming back. Zoe tightened her grip on the necklace, then slipped it around her neck. She didn't know if this was forgiveness or just the start of a conversation yet to be named, but she was ready to listen, no matter how much the truth might hurt. The room was so silent that the dry ticking of the clock on the wall seemed deafening. Zoe sat across from Richard. The father she'd never known, never named, and never imagined she'd one day face like this. Richard said nothing. He simply watched the necklace around her neck, as if it were living proof of a life he'd missed. In his eyes, Zoe saw something unexpected, pain. But not the pain of someone who'd lost it all away himself. My whole life, my mother kept just two things from you, Zoe began, her voice neither cold nor gentle. A photo and this necklace. Richard nodded faintly, as if each word she spoke was a blow he'd braced himself to take. She could have thrown them away, Zoe continued, but she didn't, because she thought, I needed to know you existed, even just once, something to keep me from hating the entire past. Richard swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally spoke. She was right. I did exist, but I made the wrong choice and then lived with that decision like a survivor, not someone who lived rightly. Zoe clasped her hands tightly in her lap. She didn't know whether to believe him or blame him more. Inside her was an unnamed expanse of emotion, not enough to forgive, not enough to hate, just a barren space her mother had silently guarded all these years. Do you know, she said, how I used to imagine my father? A kind, honest man, or at least someone good, who'd been taken by an accident, some noble reason for disappearing. She let out a faint laugh, not out of amusement, but because her heart was tightening. But in reality, you just chose money and left my mother behind. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, as if she'd just driven another needle into his chest. I can't turn back time, Zoe, he said slowly. I can't start over, but if you... He hesitated, then corrected himself. If you want to know me not as a father, but as a man who messed up and is trying to make amends, I'll be here. Zoe didn't respond. She just looked at him for a long time. In this man, who'd once made the world bow, to him, there was now only a figure carrying silent regret and a fragile hope that she wouldn't close the door forever. I don't know if I can forgive you, Zoe whispered, but I do know one thing. I don't want to go through life without knowing the rest of the truth. Richard nodded. Then let me tell you, if you want to hear it. Zoe touched the necklace at her chest, the 3 words etched on the silver still cold to the touch. Forgive, love, began. She wasn't sure she was ready to forgive. She didn't love him, nor was she certain she wanted to start anything with him. But she stayed. She opened herself to listen, and sometimes, as her mother had once written, that alone was enough to begin something yet unnamed. That afternoon, Zoe stood before the towering glass window of Richard's office, gazing down at the bustling crowd below. The city kept spinning, unrelenting for anyone, but within her something had slowed down and, at the same time, begun to stir. Behind her, Richard remained silent, saying nothing since their last exchange. Perhaps he understood that sometimes silence was the only way for a wound to start healing. Zoe turned to face him, her eyes meeting his, the man whose eyes mirrored hers so strikingly, yet who remained the greatest stranger in her life. I won't promise anything, she said, her voice calm. I don't know what I want, or how much I can accept you. Richard nodded slightly. I'm not asking you to. But, Zoe touched the pendant at her neck. I won't disappear. Not this time. Richard's eyes flickered, like a lake brushed by a gentle breeze. He didn't smile, but that look told her enough. He knew he'd been given something precious, a chance. Zoe stepped out of the office. The door closed behind her, not with a bang or a thud, just softly, like a pause in a piece of music yet to be finished. The long hallway stretched ahead. Each echoing footstep was a response from within her. She didn't know what lay ahead. She didn't know if she could ever call him father. She didn't know if she had the courage to step into a relationship that had never existed before. But one thing she knew for certain: she wouldn't let fear guide her. She wouldn't let the past chain her future. Zoe left the building, stepping into the late afternoon sunlight spilling across the pavement. Her hand still gripped the necklace, not as a wound, but as a marker. Not of complete forgiveness, not of love instantly rekindled, but of a choice. For the first time, she had the power to decide how to end the story her mother had begun, and perhaps, as the engraved words whispered against her chest, forgive, love, begin. She didn't have to do all three at once. She just had to begin.